too. You guys hear me?
We're good.
Awesome. Hi everyone, my name is Joyce Liu and I'm first speaker for Scarsdale on the Affirmative, and if everyone's ready, then my time will start on the case board. Scarsdale affirms our sole argument is strong conflict. Right now, the world is conflict-filled. Taylor 24 reports that conflict around the world has doubled over the past 5 years. The International Criminal Court presents itself as an urgently needed solution. The ICC is the only international court that can investigate and try individuals charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity when individual countries cannot. However, the court lacks the power and funding they need to reach these goals. By affirming and acceding to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the U.S. strengthens the ICC to create a peaceful international order in 3 key ways. The first way affirming saves the ICC is by removing sanctions. Devastatingly, U.S. sanctions on the ICC destroy its operations. Debusman from last week reported that Trump sanctioned the ICC after making false accusations about the court. Thankfully, Lynch 24 explains that member states are prohibited from sanctioning the ICC by the court, so the U.S. acceding forces them to remove their sanctions. Otherwise, sanctions collapse the ICC. Anderson 25 reports that 90% of global transactions become frozen as a result of sanctions, leading financial institutions to cut off relationships with the ICC, threatening the existence of the court. The second way affirming saves the ICC is by increasing resources. CTICC 22 reports that chronic underfunding has led to a significant gap between the court's workload and available resources, delaying justice. 417 contextualizes this resource gap. Domestic mass atrocity investigations in the U.S. have hundreds of times more resources than the average ICC investigation, despite being unethical. However, since the ICC is funded by its member states, the U.S. joining gives them a wealth of resources. Brown 23 reports that per Article 117 of the Rome Statute, ICC states are assigned a proportion of the overall budget based on the size of their economies. The ICC's largest funders are large economies, and the U.S. has the world's largest economy, making them necessary for ICC success. Without the U.S., if this funding gap persists, devastating trade-offs will continue to be made. For example, the ICC's July session reports that operational costs in Ukraine traded off with efforts in the Congo and Sudan. Otherwise, these devastating conflicts could be resolved. Amnesty 24 finds the conflicts in the Congo had ignited a human rights catastrophe with more than 6 million people dead, and Wall 25 reports that the conflict in Sudan already amounts a death toll of 11 million people. The third and final way affirming saves the ICC is through upholding international law. A key barrier to ICC efficacy is a lack of great power membership. Gordon explains that by not having U.S. support, the ICC's credibility is damaged, decreasing their capabilities. Gordon furthers that countries are less likely to cooperate with an international organization that cannot call on major states to help reinforce them. Thankfully, U.S. accession reinforces the power of the ICC. McKinney 13 explains that U.S. membership greatly boosts the legitimacy and workings of the court. The U.S. can lead other countries to contribute more, empowering them to support and cooperate with the organization. Even better, Vindman 21 finds that supporting institutions of justice and accountability would be a much-needed investment in the long-term viability of the U.S.-led international system. With these 3 reasons in mind, affirming to ensure the enforcement of international law is key, as Vindman 21 warns that if the ICC is ignored, then other guardrails to prevent illegal warfare may erode. Even without functioning at its full potential, the ICC historically deters atrocities. Apple 18 explains that ICC involvement in Guinea resulted in a domestic panel to investigate massacres. In Colombia, amnesty against paramilitary was lifted. In Kenya, threat of prosecution led elites to refrain from using violence, improving human rights. That's why Court Nagel 20 concludes that an ICC referral is associated with 3 times lower civilian fatalities. Strengthening the ICC will prevent countless future conflicts, saving tens of millions, and the only way this can happen is by affirming. Thank you.
Again, I'm Jackson, first speaker for the day. My case was on my first week. The summit negates. Our first contention is conflict. The ICC is currently collapsing. Lone 25 explains, by now the International Criminal Court risks collapse. The final blow seems to be coming from the USA. The proposed act by Trump will impose sanctions, visa bans, and freezing of assets. The issues with the ICC are structural, and U.S. membership cannot fix the court but only extend its problematic lifespan. Raidmaker 14 states that the ICC suffers from serious structural defects that prevent it from meaningfully contributing to international peace and security. These defects are not America's fault, and they will not be remedied by greater U.S. engagement. ICC failure is good, as the organization is historically proven to be regressive and cause fighting. Corson Act 24 explains, for instance, not only was the prosecution of Omar al-Bashir conducted in violation of international law norms, but it also compromised the efforts of mediators aimed at conflict resolution within the region. The measures taken by the ICC escalated the tensions in East Africa and led to a long-term discord. Another example was the investigation in Kenya. The ICC found itself trying to promote a resolution that had in fact already been resolved. As a result, the ICC did not lead to results. The ICC often becomes a source of new conflicts or problems. The ICC also faces challenges in respecting fundamental human rights. The most striking example is the case of Jean-Pierre Bemba. After 10 years in custody at the ICC detention center in The Hague, the ICC acquitted him of all charges, citing a, quote, gross and obvious miscarriage of justice. This was the third claim addressed to the court by persons acquitted following a trial. Furthermore, Otonu 09 describes the ICC as ignoring a horrific genocide in Uganda, explaining that government forces have kept a population of 2 million in some 200 concentration camps where they face squalor, disease, starvation, and death. 1,000 children are dying each week, yet those in a position to raise their voices have chosen to speak out in support of Museveni's, the criminal leader's, regime. Cleverly, Museveni invited the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes, yet the court seems to have been carefully steered away from the government. ICC involvement statistically lengthens conflict and causes deaths. Baroque 17 quantifies, ICC involvement significantly decreases the likelihood of conflict termination. When the ICC is involved, a 47% decrease in the likelihood of conflicts ending. Our second argument is Ukraine. Trump is about to have diplomatic talks with Russia and Ukraine, and both Putin and Zelensky want them. Osborne from a week ago explains, Putin is ready to call Trump. Trump wants to meet Putin as soon as possible to secure an end to the war with Ukraine. Putin made clear he wants to. Ukrainian President Zelensky is ready to strike a peace deal with Putin. In order to reach a settlement, it's necessary to hold negotiations. It's try or die for negotiations. Other methods like sanctions don't work, otherwise escalation and prolonged conflict. Reid from 2 weeks ago finds that a peace deal would save significant resources, but absent agreement, Putin is prepared to fight for as long as it takes. If no deal is forthcoming, they will focus on prolonging the conflict. With ICC warrants out for Putin, the U.S. recognizing these arrests in the act destroys diplomacy and U.S.-Russia relations and risks escalation. The UK 23 writes, confrontation, the Kremlin sees as an existential threat that could bring the risk of escalation. To prosecute leaders like Putin signals a desire to remove Russia's leadership, risks escalation, and complicates diplomacy. A tribunal would signal to the Kremlin that its options are to win or lose and face prosecution, making the war stakes existential for leaders. The Ukraine war must come to a stop, as it has killed millions. Gazzo 24 quantifies that about 1 million have been killed since the war began. Therefore, vote for the next.
Lastly, to arrange your first argument on conflict down 47%.
Oh, Baroque 17.
Yeah.
And then B matrix. Okay, I send it.
Okay. I'm just waiting. Sure.
Sure.
I'll start time on the first field. In your second argument about Ukraine, you mentioned that there are peace talks happening right now. What I would like to ask you, is Ukraine a part of the current peace talks?
Yeah.
Are they though? Because Zelensky said himself that if the EU is not a part of peace talks, then he will not be present in negotiations. And what is key to remember is that right now, the EU is not being involved in negotiations. What is actually happening is that Russia is negotiating with the US, and this is bad because historically, when Russia has been dominating peace talks, then they have gotten lots of concessions.
Wait, how is Russia dominating these peace talks? The U.S. is acting as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, but what's critical to remember is that right now, Ukraine is not actively involved in the peace talks. They're not including Ukraine, and they're not including other members of Europe. This is very dangerous because it means that the peace talks are going to heavily favor Russia, which means that Russia will have the opportunity to rebuild their military instead of actually following along with the ceasefire. That's what we saw happen in the past with the 2015 Minsk agreement, and we do not want that to happen again. But you can have a question.
We would make the, can I respond to that first? We would make the analysis that even if Ukraine's not part of the peace talks, they'll eventually come to the table. Even then, the U.S. is obviously not going to give in to Russia. We don't want them to get power. But could I take a question?
Sure.
Okay, so on your contention 3, why would Trump follow international law?
Of course, this is exactly what we're talking about, because right now, Trump is not showing a great following of international law, which shows that the U.S.-led international democratic system has decreasing credibility right now. However, that changes when the U.S. joins the ICC, because the ICC is the International Criminal Court. Acceding to the Rome Statute and joining the ICC shows a commitment to international law. That means that Affirmative does not only increase the wealth of resources that the ICC has access to and the legitimacy of the ICC because they are now supported by a global power, but it also means that the U.S.'s credibility and the U.S.'s commitment to international law and peace is reaffirmed.
All right, do you want to take a question or can I take a question?
Could I take a question, please? In your first contention, you mentioned that the ICC has structural issues. Could you detail to me some of them?
Okay, so some of the structural issues are there are loopholes in the ICC. There's some bad phrasing in like the papers that created the ICC. Article 98, for example.
That doesn't really sound like a reason that the ICC is bad. I'd say that there's papers that create every single organization, but what you have to look to is what the organization has actually done. And despite these quote loopholes that my opponent talks about, our evidence indicates that the ICC has been effective in decreasing conflicts. ICC involvement in Guinea.
Can I ask what year that evidence is from?
It's from 2018, but our evidence from 2020 also finds that the ICC lowers civilian fatalities by 3 times. But
Could we have that evidence?
yeah, sure.
Okay. That's, I would say a question, but that's kind of gross.
Okay, good cross.
Just send the evidence over.
Yeah.
If you're sending the evidence, just send both the pieces of evidence over. The one you said from 2018 and the one from 2020.
I just sent over the evidence. Please let me know once you guys received it. In that case,
Hi everyone, my name is Linda. I am speaking second for Scarsdale on the affirmative. The order of my speech is just going to be responding to my opponent's case, which just heard in the order that it was presented. If everyone is good, I will start on my first. Realize that our opponent's case is contradictory. At the first piece of evidence they read, they tell you that the ICC is collapsing because of U.S. sanctions. Let's just look at what our case tells you. Article 117, the U.S. has to lift sanctions if you vote for affirmative in today's round because we would have to accede to the Rome Statute. That means that the moment you affirm, the ICC stops collapsing. even then, we would say you always prefer having an international court versus no international court. Our opponents provide you no good alternatives. The ICC is the only international court, which means it is worth saving, especially given the examples that we give you, for example, in Guinea, Colombia, and Kenya, when it has worked. But then, here's more evidence. Jones Simmons 16 writes that investigation by ICC is estimated to reduce civilian killing by 57% when it did have funding in the past. It demonstrates that the ICC is authoritative. Their only piece of quantification is this 47% decrease in conflict, but it focuses on civil conflicts, whereas our evidence is more recent and more holistic. But then, let's look at some of their specific examples. They say that the ICC causes fighting because of al-Bashir. Yet they ignore our evidence from case, which is from Cornico 20, which writes that the reason why the ICC case in al-Bashir failed was because that there was a failure by the international community to enforce the warrants or pressurize the Sudanese government, which hindered the potential of ICC's terms effects. Essentially, what it's saying is that the reason why it's failed in the past is because the international community was not united over the issue. The U.S. running changes that because the U.S. is the #1 superpower and instills credibility in the ICC, which means it solves for mistakes that it has made in the past. Not to mention that it gets reinstated when it gets U.S. resources, which means that the U.S. is going to contribute a lot to the funding at the point where we don't have to pick and choose between which conflicts to regulate. We can regulate all of them. And that is why you're going to have to, for our side, if you're looking at our opponent's first argument. But then, even if you're looking at our opponent's second argument, we would say it's so hypothetical. Ukraine's peace talks have never worked in the past. In fact, BBC from 3 p.m. of today says that Kiev, which is Zelensky, has not been invited to the peace talks, according to senior Ukrainian government source. We would say this is so explicit, it's more recent than their evidence from a week ago, which says that peace talks might be working. We would say that it doesn't matter whether or not a deal gets reached, as long as Zelensky and Ukraine isn't even part of the deal, it's never going to be effective. Historically, whenever we've had peace talks, Russia just used those peace talks as opportunities to advance their military and kill more civilians. In fact, Putin is advancing his military as we speak right now. Trump does not have the Ukraine's interest in his heart. In fact, evidence from today suggests that the primary motive of Trump in these peace talks is to gain access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Clearly, this peace deal is not going to last. If you vote for them, you're voting for a failing peace deal that enables the genocide of Ukraine. But if you vote for us, Affirmative improves the chances of a deal because the ICC creates pressure. Chapter 23 writes, senior officials believe the U.S. should abandon immunity when the assault against Ukraine is so blatant. This means that when we join, things like Article 98 will be rectified. The U.S. is the main actor that pushes for immunity for non-member countries. But that changes when it joins the ICC because Trump has an incentive to make the ICC legitimate now that it has become to dominate the ICC. In the end, you have to remember that the ICC has worked in the past when it did have funding and legitimacy, and right now it is failing because of the U.S. And that is why your best route into solving all these conflicts in the world right now is by the U.S. joining the ICC, an organization that you know decreases civilian killings by 57%. And that is why you're still going to have to affirm in today's round.
Okay. Order this speech is going to be responding to the rebuttal you just heard and then responding to their case. Everybody good? Okay. Time begins on my first row. They really mishandled our first argument. They said that Article 17 means they need to affirm the resolution use of sanctions. That's our argument. With sanctions on the ICC, a regressive court. Then they say that you should prefer what the only international court there is over no court. But no, if this court is regressive and makes conflicts worse, you should not prefer it. Nothing is still better than a regressive court. Then they say that the ICC has worked out in Guinea, Kenya. But our evidence does be comparative. Even if the ICC had some benefits in some places, if the ICC never got involved, conflicts would be shorter. Then they say that our evidence about civil conflicts. But obviously the civil conflict that include genocide like those in Uganda, then it is the ICC's job to get involved. They have historically ignored these conflicts, they ignored them and they made these conflicts worse, don't endorse this ICC. Then they say the reason for the ICC failing is because of a lack of division between countries. But if that's true, that still stays post-affirmative. If countries are not united, which still happens when you affirm the resolution, nothing gets passed, which means that obviously their argument is disproven. The last one they say that the US will contribute funding, but I will get to this on their case. On Ukraine, first they say that peace talks are not working and Zelensky is not a part of peace talks. Even if that is true, we will make the analysis that if peace talks are working, then eventually Zelensky will come on the table. They say Putin is advancing his military right now. Yes, that's our argument. Putin is advancing his military right now, but peace talks are coming, which are going to mediate the conflict. The last thing they say is that Trump does not want to have, he does not have Ukraine's intent in mind. Even if that is true, he does not want Russia to obviously take over. His disdain for Russia is fully greater than his disdain for Ukraine. Obviously, the US does not want Russia, one of our biggest enemies when it comes to hegemony and global control, to take over. The US will do whatever it can to successfully stop Russia, which is what's going to happen if you negate the resolution. The last one they say is the ICC will cause pressure in a deal. But that's not true. They themselves say that the ICC has a lack of enforcement power. How does the ICC, an organization which has zero power, able to pressure Putin into peace talks? He's an irrational actor, and the ICC is not going to be able to bring him to the table or have any peace talks. Then, that's what that is. First, a bit of quick overview. Our evidence finds the reason why the ICC is not effective is because of a lot of international countries like the US, China, and Russia not joining. Even if the US does join, some of the biggest actors like China and Russia are not going to join. Obviously, that means that the ICC lacks efficiency and lacks effectiveness, and that's not going to change post-affirmative. But on sanctions, we'll go for the argument that sanctions are good. Our evidence says that when the ICC gets involved, the chance of conflict ending decreases by 47%. So the reality is you should negate and let sanctions take up this not just ineffective but also regressive ICC. They have evidence, but realize that our evidence is from Cambridge University, the most credible on this topic, so that's why you should prefer it. On funding. Number one, the US probably won't give money anyways. Brandon aims to tweet fine that the ICC struggles to get state parties to pay their dues, but it's predominantly the richest state parties that are the top debtors. Japan, France, and the UK, some of the biggest economies, yet they're the ones that are the most in debt when it comes to ICC funding. Two, the affirmative does not guarantee consistent funding. CFR finds that for agencies like the United Nations RWA, the US initially gave funding but then took it away. This actually led the agency to lay off staff and slash its health, education, and food assistance. There are two implications. One, the ICC can't rely on the US for consistent funding, and two, it is worse for the ICC to wait for the US to fund them because over-reliance can lead to travesty. Number three, assuming US continues financial support, it will actually use this as a way to politicize the ICC. John 14 finds the US, given its superpower status, would exert disproportionate influence over the court if it were to join. This could manifest in an attempt to steer the court's influence to align its decisions with US foreign policy objectives, thereby compromising the ICC's independence. But on international law, number one, the endorsement of Trump would not equal better legitimacy. He breaks international law all the time. If anything, the endorsement of Trump means the legitimacy of the ICC goes down. But number two, they say that this is perceptually good. But that makes zero sense. On this whole, we will say that number three, not only is there no need for the ICC as it extends conflicts, but terms it 20 further, that durable peace was concluded in only 4% of conflicts that experienced ICC involvement, as opposed to 24% when mediation took place without ICC involvement. In the durable peace agreement which came with ICC involvement, leaders formed rebel groups. It's a regressive code which you should not endorse.
Can I just see 4% versus 24?
Yeah, I'll send the terms and evidence.
And also that Trump is not going to pay the ICC.
Give me one second.
Oh, and also can I get Zelensky will come to speak to the table?
That's the analytic.
So no evidence?
Not yet.
Okay.
Okay, you just wanted terms with the right, 4% versus 20%.
And also that Trump is not going to pay.
Trump is what?
Is not going to pay the ICC's mandatory funding.
Oh yeah, I have some questions.
Okay, cool.
I'm sending one the 20% versus the 20% versus 4% evidence, and two is that all done. Look across.
Just waiting for that to arise to my partner to look at what we do cross, and that's all good.
Okay, sure.
I think I just got it. Actually, we're going to take a little bit of cost, cut for cost. That's good, everyone. Times this.
20 seconds of that. Would you like to sit or stand?
We can stand.
Okay, sure.
Okay, you want to take the first question?
Yeah.
Yeah, time starts now.
You tell me that Trump is going. Tell me that the U.S. is going to dominate the court and make it like politicized, right?
Yes.
If we don't pay our funding, how are we going to be able to do that?
No, I'm saying it's an either-or statement. I'm saying the more likely scenario is that the US probably won't give funding, but in the scenario that your argument is true and the US did give funding, then it will cause politicization. I can't give you a guarantee on which one it is, but it's an either-or, a lose-lose situation. But I have a question.
So you're not sure which one is actually going to happen?
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly will happen. I'm saying it's either-or. Either the US doesn't give any funding, or it does give funding and politicizes the ICC. Could I have a question?
I guess then, could I have a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Shouldn't the sanctions that Trump is putting on the ICC right now already give him this advantage to like control the ICC? Why hasn't he done it?
Wait, say it again.
You say that the U.S. joining and refunding it so much means that we're going to politicize by controlling the ICC, right? If Trump right now is cutting off 90% of ICC's business, isn't he already controlling the ICC?
Well, to a certain extent, but in the affirmative, you just give him more power, right? Because, sure, he might have leverage over the ICC right now, but he's not part of the ICC. He cannot go into the ICC in Netherlands and say, oh, I want X, Y, and Z to happen. He does not have that kind of leverage. But if you affirm the resolution and the US actually gets a spot at the table, then Trump gets the capabilities to actually enforce all his power. Could I have a question now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Are there precedents for the ICC working?
Yeah, of course. We give you a lot of it in case, right? We have 2 pieces of evidence that says that it decreases civilian fatalities by 3 times and also decreases intentional civilian killings by 57%.
Those stats, but I'm looking for specific anecdotes. Like in which countries or in which conflicts did the ICC come in and specifically like save tons of civilians?
Yeah, sure. If you click into our study, it analyzes 11 different situations, but our Apple 18 card is even better. It says that involvement in Guinea, Kenya, and Colombia pressurize these countries to have better mechanisms for protecting peace within their government.
Let's talk about Kenya, for example. What exactly happened there?
Yeah, they were able to create a domestic panel to investigate massacres.
Okay, sure, they might have created some domestic panel to investigate, but did that actually yield any benefits?
We would say yes. It meant that Guinea became like better at prosecuting their own crimes, and it's better because the ICC is a court of last resort, meaning that if a country has good justice mechanisms, the ICC doesn't have to get involved. So the threat of ICC involvement forces the country to become better at justice.
Okay,
can I get a
sure.
question?
I mean, can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
Like you keep saying the ICC did this, that, but I'm talking when it comes to actual lives. You said the ICC equals more prosecution, but when it came to civilians, what is this specific?
I told you it decreased civilian deaths by 3 times, and you never.
That's not specific to Kenya, though.
You asked me about lives.
I'm talking about, like, for example, one situation in Kenya.
I would say our case analyzes Guinea as part of this example, but
Okay.
overall, on average, it decreases civilian casualties by 3 times. It's uncontested this entire round.
Well, our evidence fine, that's not true, and we can test that anyway.
Sure. Okay, we took 20. Sorry.
Sorry, nothing.
Okay, we took 20 seconds before. We have 2 minutes 40 left. We're gonna start taking some of that now. Okay, that was 2 minutes of prep. We have 45.
Awesome. The order of my speech is going to be starting on my arguments, and then I'm going to be addressing my opponent's arguments. And I'll also be addressing some of my opponent's first arguments when I talk about my arguments, since they are quite related. Yes, I'll start on my arguments, but I'll also address my opponent's claims that I saw others as conflicts. If everyone's ready, then my time will start on my first word. Both our opponents and us agree that the number one priority in this round should be to stop worldwide conflicts. But ask yourself, how can we stop worldwide conflicts without an international court of justice? What our opponents critically miss from Linda's speech is that the ICC having an international court is better than having no international court at all. That is the only way to reinforce international law and stop the root cause of international worldwide conflicts from occurring in the first place. Therefore, let's take a look at our arguments on stopping conflicts and saving the ICC. First, you can take a look at our argument on sanctions. Both our opponents and us agree that the U.S.'s current sanctions on the ICC destroy its operations, but joining the organization forces the U.S. to remove them, preventing ICC collapse. Moreover, you can look to our third argument on upholding international order, which finds that the ICC currently lacks credibility, and the reason for this is because the U.S. is not a part of the ICC, no great power is a member, but affirming gives the ICC the credibility that they need to earn more membership and the power backing it needs to ensure cooperation among nations, solidifying its positions as an international court of justice. Now, on this argument, my opponents give a few responses that don't make a lot of sense. Their first response is that the U.S. joining doesn't improve legitimacy because of Trump. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because the U.S. is one of the greatest powers in the world. The ICC needs a great power backing, and the U.S. presents itself as an opportunity. Then they also say, again, that the ICC worsens conflict by like 24%. But this evidence is very poor because what it misses is it analyzes conflicts that the ICC intervenes in versus conflicts that it doesn't. But the conflicts that the ICC intervenes in are the conflicts where people commit the worst atrocities, where fighting is the most intense. So this is more of a correlation, not a causation, because conflicts in those areas are already bad. However, they concede our evidence from Apple 18, which finds that ICC involvement in Guinea resulted in the domestic panel to investigate massacres. In Colombia, amnesty against paramilitary was lifted. We've seen that the ICC has had positive effects around the world. Moreover, they concede our evidence from Port Nagle, which finds that the ICC decreases civilian casualties by 3 times. This is the most probable because we have seen it historically happen, and this is only going to prove when the U.S. joins the ICC because our evidence from McKinney 13 says that when the ICC has improved credibility, more states join the ICC, so it is only going to be able to solve more and more conflicts in the long term, which also will be able to solve for the Ukraine conflict. But now, addressing their arguments on conflict specifically. Our opponents say that the ICC has 47% worse in decreasing conflicts, but this evidence they concede is not holistic. It only analyzes civil conflicts, whereas our evidence is much more holistic. Finally, on their arguments on Ukraine, our opponents concede our evidence from today, which says that Ukraine will not participate in peace talks. That's bad because historically when Ukraine doesn't participate in peace talks, the war only restarts. The only way to actually ensure that there's long-term peace in the Russia-Ukraine war is by upholding international law and strengthening the international order, and the only way to do that is by affirming and strengthening the ICC. Thank you.
I'm going to take press on Okay, I'm going to take press subject now.
I think that's already covered.
It's almost now.
So first we're going to defend our case and then respond to their case. I'm on time. Judge, the first thing they say is, how do we save lives? The answer is definitely not the regressive ICC. We both agree that sanctions will destroy the ICC and joining will save the ICC. The question is whether or not that's good. Our argument is that historically prolongs conflicts by 47%. First, realize that they conceded all of our empirical evidence. The ICC ignored conflicts in Kenya, ignored genocides in Uganda, conducted investigations like those of Omar al-Bashir in violation of international law, and wrongfully imprisoned people for up to 10 years. The first response they have is that our evidence is talking about civil conflicts. Two problems. First, no, it's not. It's literally talking about civilian deaths. But second, even if that's true, civil conflict should be minimized with the ICC, not what historically happens. They give you this evidence saying deaths decreased threefold, but it literally goes on to say that, quote, interestingly, the first arrest warrants for Haroon and Khrushchev are associated with large increases in civilian fatalities and are statistically significant across. You should look to our evidence, Perot, from 2017, that is also from Cambridge University, the most credible on this topic. Going on to their case, on international law. First, the endorsement of Trump would not equal better legitimacy. He breaks international law all the time. They say that the US is a global superpower. That does matter. Trump is making our relationship with our allies worse, literally left and right, with trade wars with Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and more. He is someone that is not liked by others, and his endorsement of the ICC will only delegitimize the ICC even more. They also drop our response on politicization. If the United States joins the ICC, they'll provide funding. If you buy that they'll provide funding that will politicize the ICC, and the US will leverage this funding with the ICC. If the US can control ICC, how would they uphold international law? The US would control the ICC and they wouldn't have to prosecute themselves, showing that their allies that they won't be prosecuting themselves and destroying international law. On the way, first you should weigh on our severity. What is the impact of international law? It gets broken all the time, whereas you would prefer our argument on decreasing deaths. Secondly, we outweigh on probability. When we affirm the resolution, they tell you funding will be provided. However, if some of the ICC's biggest economies don't even provide funding, it's very unlikely the US would even provide resources and funding, seeing as the US has bad relations with the ICC due to sanctions. However, on our side, we tell you that the ICC has structural issues, and we have evidence from a Cambridge professor that the likelihood of conflicts ending decreases by 47%, and this evidence is a meta-analysis which analyzes many countries, so of course our impact will happen, as it is already shown to have been happening for the past 2 decades. Lastly, even if they give some examples of the ICC working, our evidence does the comparative. Even if the ICC saved lives in some places, there would have been even more lives saved on the app. Thank you. I mean, neg. Thank you. Vote for the neg.
Can we get the first question?
Yeah, time starts now.
You mentioned in your last speech that international law gets broken all the time. Why does international law get broken all the time?
I think a lot of leaders do not have respect for national law, and whether or not you think their decisions are correct. Every leader in the world has ignored treaties to some extent, and Trump has done that historically, which is why our analysis says he probably would not follow international law, and that's why it brings legitimacy to the ICC.
Okay, I'm really glad you brought up the point of leaders not respecting international law, because that's exactly our argument. International law and the International Criminal Court, which establishes international law, is not respected right now. But you say, when that changes when you affirm, because the U.S. joining the ICC means that a global superpower is supporting them. It's not just about Trump, it's about the legitimacy that the U.S. carries, but moreover, you concede our evidence that again and again, which finds that the U.S., when they join it, greatly boosts the workings of the ICC, and it leads to more countries joining the ICC, which means that when more countries support and respect international law, leaders support and respect international law more too.
Okay, I will just say that you said US and the ICC are all have done things in violation of international law. If Trump has done violations of international law, then when he joined the ICC, there is no reason as to why that goes away. If anything, Trump probably politicized the ICC to break even more international laws and do his bidding. If the US has violated international law so many times, why would the US enforce what they're not doing exactly in the ICC?
I think you need to look at the comparative, right? In your world, there is going to be no ICC at all and no chance of reinforcement, whereas in our world, the US is forced to provide funding and cut sanctions. There are judges on the ICC who are appointed by international non-governmental bodies. The US functionally cannot change the political workings of the system.
Yeah.
What it can do is provide legitimacy and incentivize more countries to join and follow it.
I agree, yeah. So for example, the judges, that's fine. The judges the US cannot pick. But you yourself conceded the funding argument that the ICC has a lack of funding, and when the US brings so much funding that you say the ICC gets dependent on it, and this dependency is what equals leverage for the US, which the US would use for its political agenda.
Yeah, so you would say the US already has leverage because it controls 90% of the ICC's cash inflow because of our sanctions right now. It doesn't matter, but I would say on that, the US is still a better international peacekeeper than countries like Russia or China who are going to dominate if the US does.
I'm going to really quickly respond. You can see the analysis from last clause that yes, the US does have leverage right now, but because the US is not on the ICC, it cannot actually use this leverage to carry out its agendas. But in the affirmative, in the ICC, there's a spot for the US, then the US can actually use this leverage to carry out its agendas.
I think what you can see again and again is that when the US joins the ICC, it is not just the US joining the ICC, but countries around the world joining the ICC because the ICC has more legitimacy. That means that overall, there are much more checks and balances and participation and funding going toward the ICC, which is strengthening the only international court that exists.
I have 40 seconds of prep left. I'm going to start that. It's going to start on our arguments about the credibility of the international court and then go on to their arguments. If everyone is good, time will start. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my dog. If time is all good, start on the first one. Just remember the two worlds that we and our opponents offer to you. When you vote for your opponents, we can be 100% certain that there will be no international court because US sanctions right now are crippling the court. We both agree on that. So it comes down to whether or not the court is good, and that is when you look to the evidence. The only evidence they extend throughout the entire round is the 47% evidence on conflicts. But they ignore the fact that this study only analyzes civil conflicts, whereas the ICC has jurisdiction over so much more than just civil wars. Right now it has jurisdiction over things like Israel, Palestine, and the genocide in Sudan and in Ukraine. We would say our evidence is more holistic. It analyzes all cases in the past and finds that it decreases civilian casualties by 3 times and decreases authoritarian regimes killing civilians by 57%. That's why history is on our side, and that is why probability is on our side. But then, let's look at whether or not the US is going to legitimize the international court. Their only response is just that people don't like the US, but that doesn't change the fact that the US is still a great power. The US joining the international court signals more countries to join the international court because they see the court as legitimate. Just look to, for example, the League of Nations post-World War I that collapsed because the US did not join. we would say that on that Trump still follows international law. He does things like anti-terrorism, and he does things like mediating the Ukraine conflict that our opponents present to you in his own case. Trump is currently working on fixing NATO, and there's more to the U.S. just Trump. We would say on that, the U.S. is still one of the best countries for international law, and that doesn't even matter insofar as U.S. joining the international court means the court can actually function because it can gain access to its money and funding. And that is why our argument is the most important. Addressing their insight on our evidence, we would say the Hornagle 20 evidence finds that the reason that ICC's involvement increased the casualties by 4 times is because there was no international cooperation with the ICC. That only changes when you affirm when Trump brings the international cooperation, and that's why you have to affirm.
Okay. Order of the speech is going to be responding to their case on credibility and then our argument on sanctions. And I think that. All good? Okay. So everybody's ready. This time begins on my first rule. The biggest argument that they have conceded is politicization. They have agreed that the ICC is in a dire need of funding, and in the affirmative, when the US gives so much funding to the ICC, it creates dependency. What does this mean? The US will politicize the ICC to carry out its political agendas across the world. And this is conceded coming out of both summary and final focus. The implication is that a politicized ICC, a corrupt one, is not going to be more legitimate. If anything, it decreases legitimacy, something they conceded. But the second thing we'll go for is that Trump breaks international law all the time. They have a new response which is saying, oh, Trump follows international law, he does counter-terror. Even if Trump does do some things, he is widely known for breaking international law, for breaking treaties all the time. The implication is that a leader like Trump endorsing the ICC is not going to legitimize it. If anything, it only makes it worse. And now let's talk about our argument of conflict. Just to be clear, both sides agree that right now sanctions, if they were to go on, they would kill the ICC. And both sides also agree that if we were to affirm the resolution, that the sanctions go away because of immunity. The question is whether or not these sanctions are good. Our argument is that sanctions are good because they kill the ICC, because historically the ICC prolongs conflicts by 47%. Their only response is that their evidence is better. But I urge you to look at their evidence. It literally goes on to say that in specific examples, the ICC arrest warrants actually led to more civilian deaths. Moreover, they have conceded that our evidence is from the University of Cambridge, probably the most credible evidence on this topic. Even then, you should look at history. History is on our side. They have conceded that empirical examples prove our argument. Historically, Uganda, Kenya are all examples of the ICC either ignoring conflicts or making them worse. Furthermore, the ICC conducts investigations in violation of international law. Omar al-Bashir, Jean-Pierre Bama are all examples to how the ICC has done wrong things and why it's a court you should not endorse. The last one they say is that compare the two worlds. Would you rather have one with the ICC or one with no court? Our argument is, if the only court in the world is making conflicts worse and leading to civilian deaths, then that's not a court that you should endorse. Vote next.